Hey guys, my name is Maria Dykstra, and this is my presentation of my inquiry into summative and formative modes of assessment. First, I'm going to review the differences between summative and formative modes of assessment. Then I'm going to discuss some new ideas I learned from reading different articles on this topic. First, the idea of explicit versus inexplicit forms of assessment. Then I will discuss how teachers can make sure their formative assessments are actually being effective. Finally, I'll discuss how feedback is an essential part of any type of assessment and how we as teachers can be more effective in this manner. First, let's just quickly review the difference between formative and summative assessment as is commonly understood in education today. The main goal of summative assessment is to evaluate student learning, whereas the main goal of formative assessment is to monitor student learning for purposes of improving teaching and learning in the future. In other words, formative assessment is kind of like when the chef tastes the noodles. There's less pressure because the chef doesn't expect things to be perfect right away. Summative assessment is kind of like when the guest tastes the noodles. Although this is the way we have learned to understand different types of assessment, there are many different ways that assessment can be understood. First, let's look at the idea of judgment being explicit and implicit. One author describes the different types of assessment using their functions and processes. The process of assessment refers to the mechanism that carries out a judgment. The function of an assessment is the intended use of that assessment. Using the example of a pop quiz, the process is simply grading the quiz according to the key, and the function could be so that the teacher will see how the students are doing. According to this author, all types of assessment carry out some sort of judgment. The difference between formative and summative assessment is whether or not this judgment is made explicitly. In the example of a midterm, the students receive a final grade. Here, the judgment is explicit. In the example of a pop quiz, the teacher might use the results to determine what needs to be taught in future lessons, but the actual grades of the pop quiz are not given to each student individually. In this example, judgment is implicit. There is an evaluating aspect to any kind of assessment. The difference is how the results of this assessment are used. Teachers have to decide if the judgments that they make during assessment would be most beneficial to the students if they were made explicit or kept implicitly. Another important factor to consider when comparing formative and summative assessment is the quality of formative assessment. Many teachers have experienced how summative assessments can be ineffective. The same is true for formative assessment if it is not done right. The authors of one article discussed how formative assessment must be validated to ensure that scores are interpreted and used as intended. Their proposition involves using the same type of score interpretation that is used for summative assessment, but a different structure for score use. Good formative assessment will use the scores to make decisions about teaching and learning that are intended to support student learning. These authors define formative and summative assessment in a slightly different way. Summative assessment is intended to provide a final decision about students' learning, while formative assessment is characterized by its purpose in supporting student learning. Good formative assessment should align directly with teaching and learning processes, and it will give the teacher valid and clear information to help them teach more effectively. As teachers, we have to make sure that our formative assessment is actually resulting in positive changes in the classroom. When assessment scores are not sufficiently used for their intended purpose, then formative assessment is ineffective and inefficient. I agree with a lot of what this article has to say. In my opinion, teachers have to make sure that their methods of formative assessment are being effective. That being said, formative assessment should be beneficial to students as well, not just to the teacher. Good formative assessment gives the teacher valid and clear information that will help them teach more effectively, but it also should give the student valid and clear information that will help them learn more effectively. Finally, it's important to consider how to give effective feedback. Effective feedback can be a part of formative and of summative assessment. Just because summative assessment is often considered a final grade does not mean that learning cannot occur as a result of it. First of all, feedback should be more frequent and it should be embedded in the performance process. This will help students develop their metacognitive abilities and prevent them from learning incorrectly or inefficiently. Teachers need to support and guide their students to use the results of formative and summative assessment so that they can improve their learning in the future. And as I said before, formative assessment must actually give teachers and students real information that will lead to positive changes in teaching and learning, or else there is no point. Finally, here are some practical suggestions that I gleaned from all the articles I read during this inquiry. First of all, we need to acknowledge and adjust the dynamics of power in our classroom so that we can support our students' psychological needs as learners. Two-way communication is necessary so that students and teachers can give feedback to each other and therefore learn from each other. Our feedback should point our students in the direction of better learning. Even the assessments that are usually considered cumulative or summative can have a formative aspect if we use those experiences to help our students be more successful and motivated in the future. Finally, it's important that we give our students clear expectations. Autonomy is important, but so is structure. Teachers need to find a good balance of both in the classroom. Thank you for listening to me explain some of the things I learned during my inquiry. I hope you learned something as well.